Hello everyone, my name is Liudmila Zavolokina and I'm here to present our paper titled Think Fast, Think Slow, Think Critical, Designing an Automated Propaganda Detection Tool, a collaborative effort by my co-authors Kilian Sprenkamp, Zoya Katashinskaya, Daniel Gordon-Jones and Gerhard Schwabe, all from the University of Zurich. Let me start with the introduction. Propaganda is not something new. It's been used to sway public opinion throughout history, seen in every major event from ancient times to today. Here is a formal definition of propaganda from the Oxford Dictionary. Propaganda is the systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way, to promote a particular cause or point of view, often a political agenda. But the digital age has ramped up its spread and impact. The internet and digital platforms now spread biased and misleading information faster and broader. Adding to this, generative AI brings a new challenge, creating content that looks incredibly real, from articles to videos. This blurs the line between true and false even more, amplifying propaganda's reach. But the question is, how can we turn generative AI into a force for good to fight against propaganda? About 60% of people choose digital news for its speed and convenience, as opposed to physical newspapers. This preference leads to two big challenges. First, it's hard to spot propaganda given the vast amount of online information and clever manipulation tactics. Second, we consume news so quickly that we might not critically analyze what we read, making us more open to propaganda. To tackle these issues, we first need a clear understanding of what propaganda really is. Texts use various propaganda techniques to persuade us, and researchers have categorized these techniques. For example, doubt involves questioning the credibility of something or someone. An example of this is, can we really trust a candidate who's changed their stance on healthcare 3 times in a year? Another technique is the black and white fallacy, which presents just 2 options when more exist. A classic case is, you are either with us or you are with the terrorists. Understanding these techniques helps us critically assess the information we encounter. Traditional approaches to fight propaganda include manual efforts like fact-checking, which are time-consuming and labor-intensive. Then there are traditional machine learning methods, which rely on labeled data to function. We are proposing a new approach, utilizing large language models. These models can understand and process vast amounts of information without the need for specifically labeled data. LLMs are also capable of handling more complex data like full texts. Plus, they offer the ability to explain their findings to users, enhancing transparency and understanding. However, prior studies on propaganda detection focus primarily on the accuracy of the detection of propaganda techniques and neglect the user perspective. To what extent such tools can increase our critical thinking at all? Can we improve these tools to encourage newsreaders to be more critical? So, in our study, we formulate the following question. How can we design an automated propaganda detection tool that nudges users into more critical thinking during the news consumption? How do we do this? The study uses design science research approach. First, we start with the problem definition and the definition of solution objectives based on the literature analysis. We review literature on propaganda detection, nudging, and dual system thinking theory that guides our design. Second, we go into design and development phase, where we develop our prototype, a browser extension with LLM-based propaganda detection and explanations, where we propose 5 nudges for the design. And finally, we evaluate our design in a user experiment to assess critical thinking and propaganda awareness of newsreaders, and an expert survey to assess quality of the propaganda detections. Now, let me present our solution design. Let's start with understanding what nudging means. Nudging is a concept in behavioral science that encourages people to make certain decisions or behave in certain ways without restricting their choice. It's about subtly guiding behavior in a preferred direction. In our study, we want to subtly encourage news readers to be more critical while consuming content. How do we distinguish somebody thinking more critically while reading news? This is what dual system thinking theory, introduced by Daniel Kahneman, offers for our study. This theory divides our thought processes into two systems. System 1, which is fast, intuitive, and emotional, and System 2, which is slower, more deliberate, and logical. Our solution design leverages this theory, aiming to activate both systems appropriately to counter propaganda effectively. Previously, we've identified two main problems related to propaganda. The first is the difficulty in identifying propaganda. To address this, our design goal is intuitive interaction, System 1. We aim to ensure that users can quickly and effortlessly identify propaganda, making the process intuitive. The second problem was rapid and uncritical news consumption. For this, our goal is critical analysis, System 2. So we want to encourage users to engage more deeply and reflectively with the news they consume, facilitating a more comprehensive understanding and analysis. To address these two design goals, we're developing a browser extension that highlights propaganda instances in the text on a web page that a user is reading. It highlights the propaganda instances, names them, and explains to the user. With this, we propose 5 digital nudges that aim at nudging users into more critical thinking. These nudges are based on the Fox persuasive design model. So the first two, immediate insight and autopilot mode, aim at simplifying the task of detecting propaganda in the text. So an extension provides this immediate insight. We're not using an external web page. The extension should work directly on the web page where a user reads their pieces of news. The second group of nudges aim at reminding user about the task, so alerting the user of propaganda in the text by showing the highlights, which act as stumbling stones for user while reading the text. And the third group is about increasing users' motivation to make sure that user understands what these propaganda techniques are about or why the extension detected propaganda. We propose an explainer. So we explain the users, and these explanations are generated by the large language models. Based on this example from political news about the war in Ukraine, let us look at it, how it works. So first we have a statement that was identified by large language models. In particular, we use OpenAI models here to identify a potentially propagandistic statement. Then this statement is identified or is classified as one of these propaganda techniques I showed before. And for each technique, there is an explanation that is generated by the large language model. So here, for example, claiming it was necessary to demilitarize and denazify the neighbor, the technique is identified as name calling, and the explanation is by using the term denazify, the text implies that Ukraine has a significant problem with Nazism, which can create a negative perception of the Ukrainian government and make the Russian military intervention seem more necessary. So looking at the technical architecture, on a high level, how does it work? We have a web page, we mark the text of interest, the browser extension then sends the input text in a prompt for propaganda detection, which is then submitted over an API to OpenAI, which classifies the text or the propaganda technique in particular. And then we send a second request to get an explanation of this technique. And then altogether the output is sent back to the browser extension, and the browser extension then marks propaganda and displays the explanation via tooltip on the web page. Now, let me briefly talk about the evaluation results. For the evaluation, we conducted an expert evaluation where we asked experts from political and communication science background to assess the correctness of the detection and quality of explanation. And the user experiment with 3 conditions, 3 versions. We had the first one, basic one, where users could read piece of news without any support, a light version with the support of the browser extension that gave the users the highlights of propaganda but didn't give any explanation, and the full version where the browser extension both highlighted the propaganda techniques and explained them. Here, I'm only going to talk briefly about some results from the user experiment, but for more detail, I would like to encourage you to refer to the paper. So how did it look like? In the basic version, you see here a web page. It's like a normal web page, how we are reading the news today. In the light version, only highlights were present, and in the full version, as I mentioned, the highlights were present and the explanations were given to the users. And we compared how different now the users would read this news in terms of the critical thinking. There, we used the measures from the dual system thinking theory that compared the speed, processing, control, effort, nature, and adaptability of the way how we're thinking. So we used the scale from 1 to 7, meaning 7 more critical and 1 fast. And there we differentiated between system 1 or system 2. And what we had seen, there is a significant difference indeed between the basic and the full version, as well as the light and the full version in terms of the criticality of thinking of users. Even though we should be also careful, here we see that the values are not that considerably far from each other. So with this subtle change, we could subtly change the criticality of thinking. Then we also asked the users about propaganda awareness for the light and the full version. And we had seen that in the light version, comparing to the full version, the users were less aware of propaganda. But if given these explanations, 96% of users claimed that the tool helped to become them more aware of different propaganda techniques used in the media. Now, let's briefly talk about the key contributions of our study. So first, we proposed the design of the propaganda detection tool with context-specific matching and design features to stimulate critical thinking about news readers using large language models. Second, we provide empirical evidence for its real-world applicability and effectiveness for enhancing critical thinking. And third, we emphasize the value of explanations for triggering the intended behavior change, the critical thinking. As we wrap up, I'd like to acknowledge that tackling propaganda with large language models opens up new challenges and questions. First, subjectivity and complexity of propaganda. Propaganda is not always clear-cut. How do we define what's biased and what's not, especially when opinions vary widely? Second, propaganda is much more than the language techniques. It's not just about spotting these techniques. How do we consider factors like how often something is repeated, source credibility, or emotional appeal? Third, inherent AI biases. Our models aren't immune to biases. Identifying and mitigating these is crucial to ensure that the approach is fair and effective. Finally, there is the ethical side. How do we balance our fight against misinformation with the rights to free expression and avoid censorship? Thank you, and for more information, please refer to our paper.